Okay, we still have a few people getting in, but I did want to go ahead and welcome everyone to the February advocacy meeting. We are excited that we have the ARC's National Center on Criminal Justice and Disability with us today, and Lee Ann Kingsley is the Senior Director of Disability and the Justice Senior Director of Disability and Justice Initiatives. And that is quite a mouthful there. So I am going to let her give a kind of a brief introduction, and then we will let her share her screen to give her presentation.
Thank you, Dina, and thank you so much to everyone for joining us today just to learn more about the National Center. And I did want to mention that I wasn't sure if Josh could make it today, but he is able to make it. And so he's also joining me from the National Center as well. I'm in Texas, actually. I work from a home office in Texas, Arlington, Texas, near Dallas-Fort Worth area. And Josh is in DC, so he's their local in the DC area. So we'll do just some quick introductions, and then I'll share my screen to kind of go over some of the slides. And after we give our kind of presentation, then we'll open it up for questions. So if you do have any questions though throughout, feel free to just put those in the chat along the way, so you don't have to try to remember them. Feel free to add them there. So as Dina said, I am the Senior Director of Disability and Justice Initiatives, and I've been working at this intersection of people with IDD in the criminal justice system for about 27 years now, really focused on how do we identify disability and then make sure people get accommodations so they can experience equity in the system. As you all know, that often doesn't happen because there's still such a lack of education. So I started off in social work and got 2 degrees in social work and public administration, was very interested in why we had local jail overcrowding, and also am a survivor of sexual violence myself. So all of these things just kind of culminated into a deep interest in understanding how trauma impacts people going into the justice system. And then I did a lot in mental health, did internships with Mental Health Association, different victim centers. And so all of that kind of came together in one place when I came to the ARC, and they were doing a project according to ADA to educate people with disabilities, attorneys, police, victim advocates about how to ensure that we're recognizing disability and providing those accommodations. Never looked back, continued doing that work all these years. And then 10 years ago, we were able to open a national center on this particular issue that is focused on people with IDD. So it was really a kind of lifelong dream to be able to have that opportunity. And thanks to the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance, we were able to get that seed money to start that center, and at the same time start a national training program called Pathways to Justice. So we're going to be talking a little bit about both of those today. And then I'll kick it over to Josh for an introduction as well.
Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Branch. I'm the attorney and program manager here at the Arc's NCCJD. I was originally a teacher in a special education classroom in Miami, Florida, actually. So I was in Miami, Florida, and MDCPS. And we had school resource officers on campus who could arrest students. They would often arrest some of my students, and that's what inspired me to go to law school. And so here at the center, I work on everything from responding to information and referrals to some of our grant programs that Leanne is going to speak speak to. And I also have a background in policy and legislation. So whenever there's state policies that are being proposed, I sort of take the lead on that, provide my analysis, and Leanne and I will give our feedback together. So that's my role here, and excited to be here. Thank you, Dina, for inviting us.
And Dina, I still want your last name, just for the record. If there's any way I could get that.
I have to give thanks to my husband for that.
Okay, all right.
It's mine by marriage only, so.
Great name. All right, well, I'm going to share my screen and we'll start kind of walking through the presentation. All right, is that working for everyone? Can you see it? Okay. Yes, okay, great. So we often kind of call our mission at the center as advocating at that intersection where disability rights meets criminal justice reform. And that's because we have to look at this as a holistic issue and understanding that we can't reform the criminal justice system if we're not including disability rights and the disability community. Now, you all are familiar with the ARC, I would think. So just as a reminder, we are a national organization made up of 600 plus chapters throughout the country. And we are the largest organization in the US serving people with IDD. Now, as I mentioned, we got funding from BJA, or the Bureau of Justice Assistance, 10 years ago to start this national center. And we work, which is different from a lot of places, we're able to work on both victim, witness, and suspect defendant issues. Oftentimes money will go into one way or the other, and groups kind of fit into either we're getting funding for victims issues or we're doing more suspect defendant issues. Unfortunately, that is how a lot of the federal funding streams work. But we really made a decision early on that both of those issues are equally important. So how do we make sure that when we get a chance to get funding or raise this topic, that we're providing a whole picture of what's going on for people with disabilities? And so that has led us to have a really broad portfolio of projects and contracts. And we'll talk a little bit about those. And we have 2 full-time staff, myself and Josh, and then a part-time consultant, Jessica Oppenheim, who used to oversee the New Jersey criminal justice program at their chapter for many years. And she's also a former prosecutor, which doesn't hurt when we have a lot of different information referral calls and really want to get that kind of perspective from her side. And then our target audiences include disability advocates, of course, such as yourself. Thank you so much for being here. Criminal justice professionals and people with IDD in our full chapter network. And I will say, too, that one of the things we're really wanting to expand on is looking at peers in this field. So how do we provide more support, education, and build capacity around people with IDD who want to do this work and ensure that they have every opportunity as anyone else to and get paid for that work. So that's something kind of on our radar, and that we're thinking about how to incorporate that more into the center and the different projects that we work on. So if you think about kind of the buckets of things that we do here, one is to provide training and technical assistance. So we have our Pathways to Justice training, which Josh will talk about. And then we do information referral throughout the country. That keeps us pretty busy. We see a lot of questions from law enforcement wanting training. And we also see a lot of questions around sex offense issues. So I think doing this and offering this really gives us the opportunity to see what's going on out in communities. And I will say too, if you have anything come up, we just worked with Dina recently on a case. Anything coming up, please reach out to us. We are here to be a resource around these issues. It's kind of one of those things, it's hard to take on alone. And you know, just as an example, I mean, the attorneys may not know about IDD and they may not even return these families' calls. So they're calling us because maybe the PNA can't help either. The, you know, Disability Rights Network, they have the different protection and advocacy system, but they don't always do criminal cases. So this leaves families in a lurch, and we're really here to kind of bridge that gap. But we want to work with like our chapters to work together on this so that we're all educating each other as these different cases come up. And then we want to be really kind of a center to create a resource collection, have policy briefs, different fact sheets on key cutting edge issues in the field. So I was mentioning just some of the projects that we're working on, and this is a list of some of those, and I won't go over all of them, but if you do have questions about the different work we're doing, for example, in creating online training for police, right now we've got a grant through the Department of Justice COPS office. That's community-oriented policing services, and they focus on all things related to community policing. And so we're working with them right now on that. We also have a very exciting project looking at language access barriers to justice among victims with IDD. And we're talking about people that don't use language to speak. And so we're wanting to know, how do we support people that don't speak in a traditional way, don't communicate in a traditional way, to make reports or talk about any kind of violence going on with them. And this is focused on women. It's funded through the Office of Violence Against Women. We're continuing to do work on other projects. There's one called CRIT, which is Crisis Response Intervention Training and Technical Assistance. That's free training to law enforcement that they can access online. And we're providing technical assistance for that with other partners. We've got the Home Safe project that Autism Society of America leads, and we're partnering on to address wandering and how to use locative technology when it comes to that. We just finished a project called Talk About Sexual Violence. It was a 7-year project, but now we're looking at spinning that into another possible project, educating healthcare professionals about sexual violence. And then Josh is working on a project called Improving Healthcare Transition for Justice-Involved Youth with IDD. That's been really interesting as we're trying to get information from youth themselves who are involved in the juvenile justice system, who are trying to, when they're transitioning, how is that working with their healthcare? Are they getting all their healthcare needs met? And a report's coming out soon on that. We continue to do international work through the Access to Justice Hub. And then we've got a wonderful community of practice just of our chapters who are focused on this issue. So I just paused there because I've been talking a lot. Are there any questions yet, just on kind of that opening introduction of the center and what we're working on? Nothing yet? All right, just wanted to make sure I'm giving everyone a chance to respond. So I'll jump into, you're going to hear some of the data that we know about these issues, and then a story as well, and then we'll talk about the training a little bit. So I don't know how many of you are familiar that we do actually have data in the US about how often people with IDD are involved in the criminal justice system, both as victims and as people in prisons and jails. So in both, they're overrepresented. So we like to show these infographics just to really bring that point home, and hopefully you can use these as well when you're educating people in your community about this topic. So we know that if you look at the right side, that individuals with cognitive disabilities face the highest rates of violent victimization. So the National Crime Victim Survey did not originally have disability even on their survey when they would ask crime victims different questions. So eventually it was after probably somewhere the end of the 1990s, they added disability to their survey. And so we were able to finally show just how often people with disabilities were being victimized in the US. And they also looked at people with different types of disability, and they found that those with cognitive disabilities face the highest risk of this victimization. Later on, NPR was doing a story on sexual violence issues, and using that same data set and going back and looking at that data, they found that people with intellectual disability, so not even more broadly developmental disability, not cognitive disability broadly, but specifically looking at intellectual disability, they were 7 times more likely to experience sexual assault. So this is giving us some really hard data that we can take to policymakers, potential funders, people that could provide resources in this area to say we do have data to show just how often this is happening.
Hey, Leanne.
Yeah.
We have, Virginia has a question for Josh, and you may have to unmute her on your end since you're the host.
Oh, okay. Hold on a second. Let me see if I can. Oh, Josh, you can't unmute? Ask to unmute.
No, I can
I
unmute.
can unmute myself.
Okay, go ahead. Sure.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Josh, I just have with looking at some of these things that Leah is going over. I had an individual that was incarcerated and then was taken and put into a group home instead of staying incarcerated. Eventually, he was able to go home where I took over and took care of them. How often, depending upon their function, how highly functioning they are, do they take it to the point where they go into either a normal population if they redo the same defense again and are incarcerated again? Are they given those special opportunities as being IDD all the time? Or is it, at some point they have to say, okay, you need to stay incarcerated?
Yeah, so you're asking how often is it that someone who has an IDD who's committed an offense is placed into like a special population unit as opposed to like the general population?
No, well, that, yes. And also, like, the first time he was an offender, he was then put into a group home.
Yeah,
And he stayed in the group home for a while. And then the judge, being that I was working with him and data that we had produced, said that he was okay to go live with his fiance, and they released him. But then he became, once we left, because he then let us go, he was incarcerated again. So at that point, as being an IDD, how many times will they eventually at one point leave them into being incarcerated, or will they always be put out because of being an IDD?
yeah. So those types of like that sounds like a unique diversion process, and that's typically offered for individuals who are both low risk but also like first time offenders. And so unless there was like a specialty court that was like provided, that was probably the situation that happened then. Obviously, something like this is also like offense specific, but assuming that it's like on the lower end of things, it's pretty rare for someone to get sort of like a second and third chance. Again, often those programs have like a you have to be a first time offender type of situation. So if you were to reoffend, even if it was like a lower level crime, again, it's always situation specific, but there's probably a high likelihood that they'll be incarcerated and placed in jail or into prison. And at that point, it just depends on sort of, as you said, like their their functioning, because the jail or prison is going to make an assessment as to how safe or not the person will be in a general population setting. So if they determine that the person might be low functioning, could be endangered, for their own liability purposes, they might put them in a medical wing or might put them in like a sort of isolated unit so that they're not in general population. If they don't determine that, then they probably would just put them back into general population. But again, it's always specific. And I'll put my email in the chat so you can email me too.
Okay, great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Josh. So I'll continue sharing screen. So, and I'll move a little faster too. I tend to go a little slow when I'm talking about this because I want to make every little point. Unfortunately, that takes me a while. But one of the things that we always like to bring up is why we can't stop doing this work, why we can't stop advocating is the people we know that are personally affected by these issues. And one of those is James Metters, who you see here in the kind of dark blue shirt, someone who I've known ever since I've been at the Arc for, over 2 decades. And he and I kind of met over a discussion around sexual violence issues when he told me how often he had experienced this over the course of his life, which is 4 to 5 times, which is not uncommon according to the data, that this is a very high-risk population for experience such types of assault. And so it was really exciting when we worked with the organization 1 in 6, where they had never before had a male with a disability talk about this topic in their organization. And they did a PSA, which was very popular, is available on the internet and still watched, where they interviewed different folks, but it was kind of set up where you thought it was the woman who was being asked, but it ends up, you realize it's all men that are talking about their story. So it was very powerful that he was invited to do this and took part of that. And that's the kind of work that NCCJD is about, is elevating the voices of people with disabilities experiencing these types of issues. And there we go. And on the flip side, we're talking about suspects, defendants, and those who are incarcerated. And so the data there shows us that 2 in 10 prisoners and 3 in 10 jail inmates reported having a cognitive disability. Again, the most commonly reported type of disability in our prisons and jails. So hard data here to show us just how often that this is happening amongst people with disabilities. And we don't want to leave out, we absolutely cannot leave out the issue of race and disability when it comes to this issue too. And this is one of the things that in our COPS office project we just mentioned, we're bringing in more information about the intersection of race and disability, as well as other marginalized communities, to make sure that when we think about disability, we're thinking about that in line with other identities as too, and how all of that can play a factor in people cycling in and out of the criminal justice system, not getting accommodations, how discrimination and bias can play a role in that, and really having, that honest conversation around this topic. And so if we look at some of the data here, you can see that young people with disabilities are 13% more likely to be arrested than their peers without the disabilities. But then that figure actually jumps to 17% for Black youth with disabilities. And then if we look at the overall chance of arrest, people with disabilities had an overall 43% chance of arrest, but a large number of that fell on Black men. So obviously we need to be looking at this issue very closely and thinking about how we as advocates are including every voice at the table and making sure we're very comprehensive when we're looking at different reform type of issues. Another reason why we can't stop advocating is that not only was James victimized, but we see stories like the Parsa family and the Saylor family. So some of you may have heard of Ethan Saylor's story, where he was actually killed by police because he wanted to see a second showing of a movie in Maryland. And he went back into the theater to watch that movie. And there was off-duty police there. The manager asked the off-duty police to help out, and they ended up pretty much taking Ethan down into a, prone restraint. And that actually, he died due to asphyxiation. So he could not breathe. Well, that was in 2013. That was around the same time the center started. And we worked with that mother, with Ethan's mother, to really get the word out about what had happened. Well, now fast forward to 2020, a very similar situation happened with another family, the Parsa family in New Orleans. And they were, out doing laser tag. They came out from the parking lot, and they did, ask for police to come because Eric had sort of like a meltdown issue. And so just about, within 2 to 3 months before that, they had called police, and it was a great response. The officer did great. Everything worked out fine. And so they weren't thinking anything different for this situation. But unfortunately, what had happened is the officers came and did similar thing where they took Eric down in a prone restraint position. And he even said he couldn't breathe, telling his mother he couldn't breathe. She relayed that to the officers. The mom and dad are there the whole time this is happening. She was literally holding his hands within minutes before he died. So now they're blaming themselves. What should they have done? What could they have done better? And so we're working with them to also raise awareness that this could happen to anyone if we're not putting in certain ways to educate law enforcement and provide a consistent response that is safe for everyone in these kinds of situations. And that is why at NCCJD and at the Arc, we cannot stop advocating. And now I'll pass it over to Josh just to go over a little bit of our pathways training. But before that, let's actually, I'll stop share and just see if we have any questions, either about the cases that we just mentioned or anything else.
You do have one in the chat. Let's see, Tony wants to know, is there a concerted effort to ensure those in the judicial system are provided with continuing education content relating to challenges associated with those with IDD?
So there has been some work around that since I've been doing this work. If there's specific grant funding to say, we're going to take this amount of money and we're going to, I'm trying to think of people we worked with, like certain prosecutor associations, where we're bringing in training either usually virtually, or we're creating some kind of product where we're talking about IDD specifically. So that has happened before, but not near enough the level it needs to happen. Like it's very hit or miss, and there's no mandatory training, necessarily.
All right.
Yeah.
So would it be helpful if we went to our judicial system here in our counties, or actually the state level, because that's where the money would come from, to say, hey, if you're going to have continuing ed, the reason why I bring it up, a parent brought it up to me and I verified it, and I couldn't find anything where, it was more than a PowerPoint flip chart to say, hey, you're going to receive people in your pipeline, right, that have violated the law per the statutes, and they may have disabilities. And that is it. And yes, there is the diversion programs and everything else that Mr. Branch mentioned. However, like you said, I don't think it's not mandated. And I think that's a gap. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony, for that. And we agree with you 100%. And like we hear from IACP, which is the International Association of Chiefs of Police, the largest policing organization in the US, we hear from them that there's just no way you could ever mandate that and oversee it, because there's so many police departments throughout the country. So it's such even if we mandate, how would we be able to know what they're training? Like, I think that's been one of the issues. But to your point, like different states attorney general's offices, like we've done some training in San Diego virtually pretty recently on this. If there are people within these agencies, these organizations that have interest in this and we'll talk to advocates about it, there is some hope to at least start that relationship and get that training in there. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. So if there's any, if you want to talk to us further with the Arc of Florida, if any way we can support you in that, let us know.
Well, thank you. I'm close to the Rockledge facility here in Brevard County, Florida. My experience is law enforcement is trained to determine when they come from a 911 call that was the law broken. They're not necessarily trained how to deal with a person who may be screaming, thrashing on the ground,
Right.
waving their
Right.
fists. And so, yes, some of the outcomes are tragic, but, and I know the law enforcement community here cares. It's not like they don't care and they're turning a deaf ear, but there is no consistency or, right,
Yes.
depending on the department. Sheriff's Department is probably ahead of most because they're Florida and they're more
Okay.
centralized, and right? When you have a city or town, they're funded by the taxpayers of that city or town, and your training is dependent on that, right, financial resources. So
Right.
that's just sharing my experience, not saying good or bad. There's room for improvement. Right?
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And that's the kind of thing, law enforcement are often trained to control a situation. So they think, well, we're doing our job. In the Parsons family's case, the officers actually told this mom, I'm doing my job. So your job is to make sure people don't breathe anymore. I mean, this is the kind of conversations we're having with this family, and it's literally heartbreaking to think this should have never happened. And how do we build that consistency? That's what we're trying to get at. I mean, we do have CIT trained officers, crisis intervention team. They're usually more understanding of these issues because they get that training, but sometimes they just talk about mental health mostly, or they may talk about, they have like a 1 hour place in their full 40-hour curriculum on autism, but they're not talking about IDD more globally either.
Right. Half of our, and I don't mean to take up your time, but half of our organization here in Palm Beach, Florida, are autistic and they cannot speak. So when confronted with a challenge, right, they may utter things and it's not comprehensible. And across the spectrum, it doesn't matter the age of the officer. It's just, hopefully you get somebody, like you said, is people that are sensitive or been sensitized to how to deal with it.
Yes. And my last point on that is that if you are thinking about reaching out to your police departments or sheriff's offices, always start with CIT officers. If you have them, not everybody has those, but if you have CIT trained, start there and also ask for your training officer. So there's usually someone who oversees the academy training or, doing that kind of piece of the work. And that's where you start. And they, like you said, Tony, they're usually more open and kind of more, because this is their jobs, right? This is what they're supposed to be focused on.
Well,
but I will say that even then, they don't get consistent training either about IDD.
No,
so
I agree. I agree. Thank you for that. I will go ahead because I live 3 miles from the training facility here at Eastern Florida State College. So
great.
Real quick, Leanne, we have a question. What about individuals that self-harm?
So what is the question? Can you come off mute and kind of tell us more about what you're asking about that, Kevin?
My audio.
My name is Kevin Jenkins, and I have a question about when they scratch themselves and they had the police department come in and they put them on a stretcher and they send them to the places where they are allowed for a couple months or so to re-heal, to get that. Like if they scratch their face and they keep doing it for a long time. And they call the police department because this is like harming themselves.
Right. So that is a reason sometimes why police are called. And that can, lead to different responses as well, depending on how much the officer knows about self-harm, about people with disabilities. And what we're concerned is that the officer, will also think that they're going to be harmed, even if the person maybe not be intending that. if they don't know about disabilities or mental health issues, they may not make that connection. So I think that you raise a good point about thinking about that as an education piece when we're training officers. Is it, Kevin, that you think officers don't really know about that and that they need to understand about self-harm?
They don't. They
Okay.
really don't. It was actually at a group. It was like assisted living,
Okay.
calling it, because I knew somebody that was scratching herself, and she went in, closed the door. She would not open the door.
I see.
They called the police, and the police department came, and so they called the ambulance. Then they put her on the stretcher like 3 or 4 times. This has happened.
Well, that is a really good point, and I'm glad you raised it. And it makes me think that I wish we had data to tell us why officers are called to the scene, to these different situations. Oops, somebody came off mute.
22 and 1.
I did, Gina.
129, 8212. That's a mistake.
Oh, okay.
Can
Is
I
there a
say
question?
some? Is that Well, I wanted to add to that too, is that for Kevin, is that I think sometimes the advocating or the teaching needs to also go through hospitals, as well as what Kevin is bringing up, is that, you know, when you take an individual who is in a behavior and self-harm or whatever, and they go to the hospital, a lot of times they just don't know what to do with them. And, you know, they may sedate them for a little bit to calm them down, but there's no, and then of course they go off to a whole what do you call the
Like a group
to
home?
a Baker Act place.
Oh, yeah, Baker.
And 'cause I had an individual who was Baker acted. He went to the hospital. He spent some time there. The ambulance came, picked him up, and then took him to a facility, was taking him to a facility. The ambulance drivers didn't ask what the condition of him was. Was he sedated? Is he okay to travel? He was traveling several miles, over an hour's drive to the facility. When he came out of a little bit of a sedation, he started, because he didn't know where he was. Nobody told him. Nobody explained to him what was happening. So he hit the lady that was sitting in the back with him. They pulled the ambulance over. He jumped out of the ambulance because he was confused. He was in a nightgown. He was running through fields. And the next thing he knows, he's being surrounded by police officers with mace and dogs. And he doesn't understand what's going on. So it's not also the police officers too that I feel a lot of education when it comes to behavioral wise,
Yeah.
is that hospitals also need to understand that individual, or, you know, that situation when parents have to Baker Act. And the only way to Baker Act is to call the police and then call the ambulance to get them to go to the hospital. You can't just bring them in. It won't work that way. So, you know, I think that also has to help for those situations for our individuals.
Yeah,
So.
really, really, really good point. And we have some programs that are attempting to better educate our medical folks about just people with IDD. There's a program that we're looking at pitching some funding for out in Massachusetts, Operation House Call, where they have people with disabilities they have medical students going to the homes of people with disabilities just to learn more about their lives, their families, you know, in a more kind of organic way of learning about each other. And that in that, you know, medical students get them early while they're still listening. Will start to have a better understanding about the disability community, specifically people with IDD. And so that when these kinds of things do happen, you know, they'll be more understanding, they'll be more curious and want to do more than just whatever's, you know, they think they were trained in their classes to do. They'll think about disability too. So thank you for raising that. That's a really good point.
Wanted to bring up-
Oh, go ahead,
May I bring up
Tony.
one more thing? And continuing
Sure.
that thread, the other gap, at least in my county, there are no group homes like there are in a lot of other states. Florida is not right, and I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that the cycle is Baker Act. You have 2 facilities here in Florida,
Right.
at least in my county, Circles of Care in Palm Point. Then you're out after 72 hours. If you happen to go to the Sharps Detention Center, whatever it's called, which is not a great place, especially if you're on medication, right?
Mhm.
Because this is certainly not the care and attention you may need. So all I'm saying to you is there's some other gaps that need to be filled. So it's like a holistic thing. It's not
Yeah,
just,
that's
you know,
right.
the end result is law enforcement. Their job isn't to fix you. Their job is to get you in the system, and a judge will tell you to get out. And then on the mental health side, right, it's like a ping pong thing. And so again,
Yes.
it's a challenge that I
So
know
true.
that has to be addressed, right?
Oh, Tony, you're pretty much gearing up Josh for his next talk about why we have pathways. Because
Well,
the whole point of pathways is like you can only train so much, and then where do people go?
correct.
And so
That's
then it
correct.
becomes a question of divert to what, which we have
To
another
what?
publication we worked on that I'll put in the chat. It's all about that issue. But for now, I know just to give Josh a chance to speak, let's put a hold in the questions for a second. Josh, can you just go over maybe a couple of the slides of pathways? Because I know I want to have more back and forth with everyone, but I'll share my screen if you want to just talk through a couple of these.
Sure. Yeah, I can do that.
So I will, oops. Okay, this is our first. Which one do you want to do, Josh? I'll let you decide.
That works. I could just speak from here. So our Pathways to Justice model is really, it provides a training, but it's more than that. It's really a holistic program approach. So we bring people together, and one thing that we do is sort of create an analysis, like a system analysis of a community's criminal justice system. And if you see here, there's a victim side as well as a suspect offender side of things. And we walk through with the community and basically ask ourselves, how is the ADA being accommodated throughout each phase of the criminal justice system to ensure that it is accessible to individuals with IDD. So, you know, is dispatch receiving training on IDD? Does the jail have accommodations? Are attorneys or judges trained on how to interact with individuals with IDD or with the ADA? What sort of accommodations or diversion practices are available for folks? So we go through the entire system with the community to really analyze their individual system and their circumstances. Do you want to go over to the next slide, Lan? And so we do that analysis with a disability response team. And this is an example of a disability response team here pictured. So disability response team really is bringing professionals from the community together all in one room, because sometimes, you know, we find out that, you know, group housing are not necessarily communicating well with law enforcement, or law enforcement might be siloed off and is not necessarily connected to their disability community. If you go to the next slide, I think that shows the DRT. Yeah. So this is an example of who could make up a DRT. So we collaborate with the local ARC chapter, and then we bring these different sort of bundles of professionals together. So law enforcement, victim services, legal professionals will come together to discuss the criminal justice system. Then we also have the disability community, family advocates, the ARC, other disability advocates, and self-advocates. And they all come together to analyze their system, to see how it's working, how it's not working, and really build out this DRT so that they could have a sustainable model for change moving forward, as opposed to a one-day training. Now, Pathways does include a training, and the great thing about that too is that all these folks will be together for one portion of the training, but then they'll also break off to their own individual modules based on their area of expertise. So the training that law enforcement will receive will be specific for law enforcement. The training that legal professionals receive will be specific to them, and so on. This is just an example of a fact sheet that we have that's pretty popular. We have a bunch of resources like this on our website that you can download yourself as well and provide to community members. And then this is where we've done Pathways before. We'd love to do one in Florida. So you see, we haven't done one there yet. So we'd love to do it there too. And this is our contact information. I put my email, branch@thearc.org, in the chat as well.
Thank you, Josh. And we do also have our, I think I put that actually in the chat too, the NCCJD link. You can link directly to the Pathways to Justice information. And then I also put in the chat, we were recently able to do a short video interviewed by Comcast, and that's on some of the Comcast cable channel. So that's on our, that's a good kind of tool to use if you are looking to educate your community about this issue, because it's not very long. And we're looking for ways to get this information out in some kind of sound bites in different ways so that it's easier just to help you as advocates know how to get this message out to those in your community and in your kind of orbit. So that is it for us. Let's continue with the questions. I think there was some more in the chat. Was there?
Matthew had one about asking, is there a national push to do this as far as the voluntary registry that you can put people with IDD on? Is there a national push?
So there are some concerns around that, around using registries because of, you know, registries have their own issues. And I don't know that everybody knows about that. You know, one of the things that we're trying to do through the National Center is just provide a balanced perspective on some of these options that are being used out there to try to address the issue of people with IDD coming in contact with the justice system. And we actually created a policy brief on this very topic because we were seeing this happen so much throughout the country and chapters calling us and saying, what do you think? What should we do? And we have an active case right now with the state where there's legislation being passed. And you've got some in the disability advocacy community saying, oh, no, 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 we don't do registries. That is not what we do. And then you've got other parents out there saying, but if it can help my child or my adult child with police encounters, why can't we do it? It's voluntary. Well, there's lots of questions around that. So I would say that to become as educated as possible, just to know the pros and cons of all of that. And I know that there's definite concern in the sort of national disability space that we should never push for a national registry like that. So I'm going to open that up because I see other people looking at me and with thoughts. Anyone else want to chime in on that one? And as we do, I can put the link to that policy brief in here.
I'll also share, when I share the presentation, I'll share those two links and then email as well. But if people, I think you're able to unmute, or if not, raise your hand and
Yeah.
unmute.
Yeah, I can. I would say I agree with Leah. As far as a registry, there can become a lot of problems with registries and things getting out, important information getting out that doesn't need to be released to certain people and things like that. So when you open up that registry, you open it up to a public division, which would, not protect their rights as a citizen, or as an individual with IDD. So I do agree that there should not be any kind of a registry for individuals with disabilities. Plus, you don't want to segregate them from the rest of the, communities. And that's putting them into a separate category of, okay, I'm different from Josh and Leah. I'm not the same because I'm on a registry that shows that, I have something wrong with me. And we're trying to help them understand that there is nothing wrong with them, that they can do anything that they believe that they can do as long as they try hard enough to do it. So I do agree with you.
Well, and another way to think about this too is I did put the brief in the chat, but underneath that, an NPR interviewed me recently for a story where they're looking at this court that was created specifically for people with autism. So, of course, the hope is to divert people away from the criminal justice system, which is great. There is no argument there. We all agree on that, but the how is what we need to be thinking about. So I, posed a question to the reporter in this story about, is separate equal? So this is creating a separate court system. And should we be putting our money into building all these separate services for people, or should we educate all the judges, educate all the police? I mean, so that we're all in the same, inclusive community. And, sometimes people don't think about that because they're desperate for answers today. And we need to get help for my son today. So tell me how to do that. But we also have to think, well, what about long term? What are we setting up in these systems so that when people slip through the cracks, though, what about all those other courts where you're never going to have enough money to put in special courts everywhere in this country? So it's the same kind of issue, separate, creating these separate registries and having separate courts. And, it's something we really need to be thinking about as disability advocates.
I wanted to add, recently we went to the Palm Bay Police Department and we did a tour because we like to do those things. Spoke to them and they said at a minimum, a caregiver or parent should tell the 911 office, to somehow they can put a flag in the system that there is a special needs individual in the house in confidence. It doesn't get broadcast to anybody,
Okay.
right? So that if they do respond, right, it's used to be years ago, we used to have the vial of life you put in your refrigerator. If you had, couldn't speak and you're, I'm a senior myself, but, had them in the refrigerator, had all your medications on it. Kind of similar thing is kind of flag yourself. And then we also talked about physical cards to give each person to have them a lanyard or something like that.
Okay.
But there's plenty of things that are not, if you will, stigmatizing
Invasive.
in a sense, right?
And Tony, to that point too, there's another example of this. We're working on that project I said, Home Safe, it's using locative technology. Well, how many people want to be tracked that have disabilities? While
That's correct.
a child who wanders off and drowns, and that's why this legislation came about. There was so many children, right, dying from wandering off. And then now the government's providing money for tracking devices. But what we're saying in that is that should be a last resort. There are many other things you can do, like look at why people wander, maybe look at how you can do things in your home, that does not go all the way to making sure someone's tracked. So there's all kinds of like debate around that too. So it's, you know, it seems like it's in every facet that we're having these same conversations. What does true inclusion look like? And are we
Sure.
getting there?
Yeah, it crosses privacy and HIPAA boundaries, so it's kind of sometimes tough. Agree.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any other hands or questions in the chat. But I will, like I said, I'll send out the information. It will have Leanne's email along with Josh's, so that you can ask if you have specific questions or whatnot. But we truly appreciate Leanne and Josh getting on to kind of educate and inform, and this is an ongoing topic, definitely.
Well, we're happy to come back at
thank
any
you.
time. So just let us know how we can support all of your efforts in Florida. We are happy to help.
Right.
Thank you
All
so
right.
much. Very grateful.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
y'all.